Sometimes the most broken hearts find each other in the darkest moments. On a frozen Nebraska night, a struggling single father discovers what looks like an abandoned woman clutching two sleeping children in the snow. Graham Ellis has been barely keeping his family afloat since losing his job, working emergency repairs just to pay rent. When he finds Alexandra Pierce, a billionaire, he doesn't recognize her shivering in a torn evening gown. He simply does what feels right. He takes them home. 1 week later, after sharing meals and quiet moments, she asks him to marry her, not for money or convenience, but for something neither expected to find again. Can two people from completely different worlds build something real together? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The ice storm had hit Millbrook, Nebraska like a sledgehammer, coating everything in a crystalline shell that turned the small town into a treacherous wonderland. Graham Ellis adjusted his wool cap and squinted through the windshield of his battered Ford pickup as he navigated the slick streets at 11:30 on a Tuesday night. The emergency call had come in 20 minutes ago, 3 streetlights down on Maple Avenue, creating a dangerous blind spot near the elementary school. At 54, Graham had learned to take whatever work came his way. The construction company where he'd spent 15 years had folded 6 months ago, another casualty of the economic downturn that seemed to hit small towns hardest. Now he scraped together a living doing handyman work, emergency repairs, and whatever odd jobs kept food on the table for himself and Maya. Maya. Even thinking her name brought a smile to his weathered face. 12 years old and already more talented than most adults he knew, his daughter had inherited her mother's gift for music. Sarah had been gone 4 years, no cancer, swift and merciless. But her spirit lived on in the way Maya's fingers danced across violin strings, coaxing melodies that could make grown men weep. The pickup's heater wheezed as Graham pulled up to the first damaged streetlight. The pole had snapped clean in half, the fixture dangling by its electrical cord like a broken ornament. He'd seen worse, but in this weather, even routine repairs became dangerous. The temperature had dropped to 8 degrees, and the wind cut through his worn Carhartt jacket like it was made of paper. Graham had volunteered at St. Mark's Community Church for 3 years now, ever since Pastor Williams had approached him about helping with their outreach programs. The church hall served as an unofficial shelter during emergencies, and Graham often found himself there on nights like this, making sure the heat worked and the coffee pot stayed full. It wasn't much, but it felt good to help people who had even less than he did. As he worked to secure the dangling streetlight, Graham's thoughts drifted to the conversation he'd had with Maya that morning over breakfast. She'd been accepted into the Regional Youth Orchestra, incredible honor for a kid from Millbrook, but the program required her to travel to Lincoln twice a week for rehearsals. The gas money alone would strain their budget, not to mention the cost of proper sheet music, and eventually a better violin than the 3/4 size instrument she'd outgrown. "Dad, I don't have to do it," she'd said, spooning cereal into her mouth while studying for a math test. "I know money's tight." Graham had stopped spreading peanut butter on toast and looked at his daughter, really looked at her. She had Sarah's dark hair and serious brown eyes, but there was something uniquely Maya in the way she held herself, the quiet determination that reminded him of his late wife, but somehow stronger, more resilient. This kid had weathered her mother's death, their financial struggles, and the upheaval of small-town life with a grace that humbled him daily. "Maya Elizabeth Ellis," he'd said, using her full name the way her mother used to when she wanted to make a point. "You're going to play in that orchestra. We'll figure out the rest." Now, standing in the bitter cold with ice crystals forming on his beard, Graham wondered how exactly they would figure it out. His savings account had exactly $437. The truck needed new tires before winter got worse. The rent was due in 2 weeks, and Mrs. Henderson, their landlord, had been patient but firm about needing the payment on time. The second streetlight was more complex. The entire electrical housing had been damaged by falling ice. Graham hauled his toolbox from the truck bed, the metal handles so cold they burned his fingers even through work gloves. This would take at least an hour, maybe two if he ran into complications. That's when he saw her. At first, Graham thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. The figure beneath the darkened marquee of the old Rialto Theatre looked like something from a dream or a nightmare. A woman in what appeared to be an evening gown, sitting on the frozen steps with two small children pressed against her sides. Graham blinked hard, certain the image would disappear, but she was still there, her dark hair whipping in the wind, her shoulders shaking with either cold or sobs. The children, they couldn't be more than 5 or 6 years old, were clearly asleep, their small bodies curled against her for warmth. Setting down his tools, Graham approached slowly. He'd learned during his years volunteering that people in crisis could be unpredictable, and the last thing he wanted was to frighten someone who was already in distress. "Ma'am," he called softly when he was about 10 feet away. "Are you all right?" The woman's head snapped up, and Graham saw a face that was both beautiful and devastated. Her makeup had run in dark streaks down her cheeks, and her lips were pale with cold. The dress, it was indeed an evening gown, something sparkly and expensive-looking, was torn at the shoulder and completely inappropriate for the weather. She started, then stopped, looking around as if she'd forgotten where she was. "My car broke down, I think. I'm not sure." Graham noticed she was barefoot. In 8-degree weather, this woman was sitting on frozen concrete steps without shoes, holding 2 sleeping children who were also inadequately dressed for the conditions. "Let me help you," Graham said, already shrugging out of his jacket. "What's your name?" "Alexandra," she said quietly, accepting the coat and wrapping it around the children. "These are my—" She paused, looking down at the twins with an expression Graham couldn't quite read. "Theo and Rosie. I'm Graham. Graham Ellis." He knelt down beside them, noting that both children were breathing normally, but were dangerously cold. "How long have you been out here?" "I don't know. A while." Alexandra's voice was hollow, distant. "We were at a restaurant. There were photographers and lawyers, and everyone was shouting. I took the kids and left. I started driving, and then the car made a noise and stopped." Graham glanced around, looking for a disabled vehicle, but saw nothing. Whatever had happened, these 3 people were in immediate danger from the cold. The children, especially hypothermia, could set in quickly at their age. "My truck's right over there," Graham said, pointing to the Ford. "It's warm, and I've got blankets in the back. Let me get you somewhere safe, and we'll figure out the rest." Alexandra studied his face in the dim light from the one working street light. Graham could see her weighing options, trying to decide whether to trust a stranger. He understood her hesitation, single woman, 2 children, middle of the night. But the cold was making the decision for her. "Okay," she whispered. Graham gently lifted Theo, surprised by how light the boy was. The child stirred but didn't wake, instinctively curling into Graham's warmth. Alexandra managed to stand with Rosie in her arms, though Graham could see her legs were unsteady, whether from cold or exhaustion. Getting them to the truck, Graham cranked the heat to maximum and pulled emergency blankets from behind the seats, a habit he'd developed after too many winter service calls. Both children began to stir as warmth returned to their small bodies. "Where can I take you?" Graham asked, settling behind the wheel. "Do you have family nearby? A hotel?" Alexandra was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the empty street. "I don't know," she said finally. I can't think right now." Graham made a decision that would change everything. "The church has a community hall with a kitchen and a couch that pulls out into a bed. It's warm and safe. You can spend the night there, and in the morning we'll figure out what comes next." As they drove through the silent streets of Millbrook, Graham couldn't shake the feeling that he was looking at a woman who had lost everything. The expensive dress, the way she spoke, the fact that she'd mentioned lawyers and photographers, all of it suggested wealth, privilege, a life far removed from his own. But sitting in his truck, holding her sleeping children, Alexandra looked like any other mother who'd reached the end of her rope. St. Mark's Community Church sat on a tree-lined street, 6 blocks from the town square, a modest brick building with a simple white steeple. Graham had his own key to the hall. Pastor Williams trusted him completely, and within minutes he had the lights on and the ancient furnace coughing to life. The hall was nothing fancy: folding tables, metal chairs, a small kitchen with a coffee pot and a hot plate, but it was warm and clean, and most importantly, it was safe. Graham helped Alexandra settle the children on the pull-out couch, covering them with every blanket he could find. "There's a bathroom through that door," he said quietly, "and I'll put some coffee on. Are you hungry? I think there are some crackers in the kitchen." Alexandra shook her head, then seemed to reconsider. "Maybe some water?" While Graham busied himself in the kitchen, he heard the front door of the church open. Maya's voice called out, "Dad, your truck's outside. Everything okay?" Graham's heart swelled with pride and mild exasperation. His daughter had probably been watching from their apartment window, waiting for him to come home from the repair job. When she saw the truck at the church instead, she'd walked over to check on him. At 12 years old, Maya had an overdeveloped sense of responsibility that both impressed and worried him. "In here, sweetheart," Graham called softly. "We have some unexpected guests." Maya appeared in the doorway, violin case in hand. She'd been practicing, as she did every night before bed. She took in the scene with the quick intelligence that reminded Graham so much of her mother: the woman in the torn evening dress, the two sleeping children, the improvised shelter. "This is my daughter Maya," Graham said to Alexandra. "Maya, this is Alexandra, and those are her children, Theo and Rosie." Maya nodded politely, the way Sarah had taught her. "Nice to meet you. Are you okay? You look really cold." Something in Maya's gentle question broke through whatever wall Alexandra had built around her emotions. Tears began flowing again, but silently this time, without the earlier desperation. "I'm better now," Alexandra said, and Graham could hear the truth in it. "Your father, he helped us when we had nowhere else to go." Maya set down her violin case and moved closer to the couch, studying the sleeping twins with curiosity rather than suspicion. At 12, she was old enough to understand that sometimes people needed help, and young enough not to question whether they deserved it. "They're really little," Maya observed. "Are they twins?" "Yes, they just turned 5. Alexandra's voice was stronger now, warmed by Maya's unguarded acceptance. "I could play something soft," Maya offered, glancing at her violin case. "Sometimes music helps people sleep better." Graham felt his throat tighten with emotion. This was exactly the kind of person Maya was: thoughtful, generous, instinctively kind. She'd learned it from her mother, but she'd refined it through their own struggles, understanding what it meant to need help from others. "That's very sweet," Alexandra said, "but I don't want to wake them." "I can play really quietly," Maya assured her. "Mum always said music was like a lullaby for the soul." Without waiting for permission, Maya opened her case and lifted out her violin, a modest instrument that had belonged to her mother, carefully maintained despite its age. Graham held his breath as she raised the bow, wondering what piece she would choose. The first notes of Claire de Lune floated through the small room, soft and achingly beautiful. Maya had learned the piece just last month, and Graham had never heard her play it with such tenderness. The melody seemed to wrap around them like a warm blanket, and he watched as the tension in Alexandra's shoulders finally began to ease. Both twins stirred slightly at the sound, but instead of waking, they seemed to settle deeper into sleep. Rosie's thumb found its way to her mouth, and Theo's breathing became deeper, more regular. When Maya finished, the silence that followed felt sacred somehow. Alexandra was looking at his daughter with something approaching wonder. "That was beautiful," she whispered. "You're very talented." Maya blushed, but stood straighter. "I'm going to be in the regional youth orchestra. Dad says we'll figure out how to make it work." Graham caught the slight emphasis on "Dad says" and smiled. His daughter was proud of him, proud of his determination to support her dreams, even when the practical side seemed impossible. "That's wonderful," Alexandra said, and Graham could hear genuine pleasure in her voice. "Music is a gift that keeps giving. It brings beauty into the world when there's too much ugliness." They sat in comfortable quiet for a while, listening to the old building settle around them and the occasional whisper of wind against the windows. Graham found himself studying Alexandra's face in the soft light, noting the way exhaustion and relief were fighting for dominance in her expression. "I should let you rest," he said finally, standing to gather his tools. "I'll be back in the morning to check on you. If you need anything during the night, Pastor Williams lives in the house next door." "Tell him," Graham said, "it was okay." "Wait," Alexandra said as he reached the door. "I don't know how to thank you. You don't even know me, and you've—" "You don't need to thank me," Graham interrupted gently. "Sometimes we all need help. Tonight, it was your turn to need it, and my turn to give it." Maya had packed up her violin and was pulling on her coat, but she paused at the door. "I hope the twins like pancakes," she said to Alexandra. "Dad makes really good ones. Maybe we could have breakfast together." The invitation was innocent, spontaneous, but Graham could see its impact on Alexandra. For a moment, her carefully controlled expression cracked, revealing something raw and grateful beneath. "I'd like that very much," she said. As Graham and Maya walked home through the quiet streets, their footsteps crunching on patches of ice, Graham reflected on the strange turn his night had taken. He'd started out intending to fix broken streetlights and ended up offering shelter to a woman and 2 children who seemed as lost as they were cold. "Dad," Maya's voice was thoughtful. "Do you think she's in some kind of trouble?" Graham considered the question. The expensive dress, the mention of lawyers and photographers, the way Alexandra had seemed genuinely confused about where she was, all of it suggested a story more complicated than a simple car breakdown. "Maybe," he said honestly, "but that's not really our business, is it? What matters is that she and those kids needed help, and we were able to give it." Maya nodded, satisfied with the answer. She seemed really sad, but also kind of relieved, like she'd been holding her breath for a long time and finally got to exhale. Graham looked down at his daughter, amazed as always by her emotional intelligence. "That's a very grown-up observation, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups forget how to ask for help," Maya said with the wisdom of someone who'd learned to be self-sufficient too young. Maybe she just needed someone to remind her that it's okay. As they climbed the stairs to their small apartment above Henderson's hardware store, Graham couldn't shake the feeling that Maya was right. Whatever had brought Alexandra and her children to that frozen theater steps, it had been desperation mixed with a kind of stubborn pride that Graham recognized. He'd felt it himself in the months after Sarah died, when well-meaning neighbors offered casseroles and babysitting help that felt too much like charity. But there had been something else in Alexandra's eyes when Maya played violin, a recognition, maybe, or a memory of something beautiful that had been lost. Graham had seen that look before, in the mirror, on the nights when Maya's playing reminded him so strongly of Sarah that it hurt to breathe. Maybe, he thought as he turned off the living room light, sometimes the people who seem to have everything are the ones who need help the most. And maybe, just maybe, helping them was exactly what he and Maya needed too. Alexandra woke to the sound of children's laughter and the rich aroma of coffee brewing. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. The ceiling above her was unfamiliar, painted institutional white with water stains in one corner. Then it all came flooding back: the disastrous evening at Le Bernardin, the photographers shouting questions, Marcus's lawyer serving papers right there at the table, and her panicked flight with the twins. She sat up carefully, noting that someone had covered her with an additional blanket during the night. Theo and Rosie were no longer on the pull-out couch beside her. Instead, their voices carried from what sounded like a kitchen, mixed with the deeper tones of a man and the lighter voice of a young girl. The torn evening gown felt ridiculous in the morning light. Alexandra looked around for her purse, her phone, any connection to her normal life, but found nothing. She must have left everything in the restaurant or the car, wherever the car was. The realization should have terrified her, but instead she felt oddly liberated. "Mommy!" Rosie's voice called out. "Come see. Maya's daddy makes pancakes that look like animals." Mommy. The word hit Alexandra like a physical blow. She'd been fighting for the legal right to that title for 8 months, ever since Marcus had filed for full custody. His lawyers claimed she was an unfit parent, too focused on her business empire to properly care for 2 5-year-olds. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd built Pierce Technologies from nothing precisely to provide security for her children, and now that success was being used as evidence against her maternal instincts. Alexandra finger-combed her hair and tried to smooth the wrinkled dress before venturing toward the kitchen. What she found there stopped her in the doorway. Graham stood at a small gas range, wearing the same work clothes from the night before, but somehow looking perfectly at ease as he flipped pancakes in a cast-iron skillet. Maya sat at a folding table with Theo and Rosie, showing them how to draw musical notes on napkins. The twins were clean. Someone had obviously helped them wash their faces and hands, and they were wearing what appeared to be Maya's old t-shirts as makeshift nightgowns. "There's our sleeping beauty," Graham said, glancing over his shoulder with a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in months," Alexandra admitted, surprised by the honesty in her own voice. "I can't remember the last time I slept through the night without waking up to check emails or review contracts." "No phones allowed at breakfast," Maya announced solemnly. "It's a family rule. Dad says food tastes better when you're paying attention to it." Family rule. Alexandra felt something twist in her chest. Her own breakfasts were usually consumed standing at her kitchen island while scrolling through overnight reports from her international offices. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten a meal with the twins without some form of digital distraction. "Speaking of which," Graham said, sliding a plate of perfectly golden pancakes in front of her, "Maya mentioned you might be hungry. These are my specialty buttermilk pancakes with just a touch of vanilla." The pancakes were shaped like butterflies, and Alexandra found herself smiling for the first time in weeks. "They're beautiful. You didn't have to go to all this trouble." "No trouble," Graham assured her, settling into the remaining chair with his own plate. "Besides, Maya likes having people to cook for. Usually it's just the two of us." As they ate, Alexandra watched the easy interplay between father and daughter with something approaching envy. Graham listened when Maya talked about her upcoming orchestra audition, asking thoughtful questions about the pieces she'd chosen. Maya, in turn, seemed genuinely interested in her father's work, discussing the previous night's streetlight repair as if it were the most fascinating engineering project in the world. Both of them included the twins naturally in the conversation, asking about their favorite foods and activities with the same attention they gave each other. Theo, who was normally shy around strangers, was explaining his elaborate theory about why dinosaurs were actually just very old dogs. Rosie was teaching Maya a clapping game their nanny had shown them. "Can we stay here forever?" Rosie asked suddenly, her small face serious. "I like it here. It's quiet and nobody's yelling." The innocent question hung in the air like a challenge. Alexandra felt Graham's eyes on her, gentle but curious, and knew she owed him some explanation. "We can't stay forever, sweetheart," Alexandra said carefully. "This is Maya and her daddy's special place. We're just visiting." "But where will we go?" Theo asked, his dark eyes so much like his father's suddenly worried. "We can't go back to Daddy Marcus's house. He makes you cry." Graham cleared his throat diplomatically. "Well, I was thinking we could worry about that after breakfast. First, though, we should probably figure out what happened to your car." Alexandra realized she had no idea where she'd left the vehicle. The previous evening was a blur of emotions and desperate decisions. "I remember driving, but I'm not sure where I stopped. Everything after leaving the restaurant is fuzzy." "That's okay," Graham said kindly. "Shock can do that. Why don't we take a drive around town? Millbrook's not very big, we'll find it." 20 minutes later, they were all piled into Graham's pickup truck. The twins were fascinated by the bench seat and the manual windows, treating the ride like an adventure. Maya pointed out local landmarks with the pride of a tour guide, explaining the history of the grain elevator and the story behind the bronze statue of a Civil War soldier in the town square. They found Alexandra's car in the parking lot of a truck stop on the outskirts of town. The black Mercedes sedan looked impossibly out of place among the pickup trucks and farm equipment, like a piece of expensive jewelry dropped in a cornfield. "There it is," Alexandra said, feeling a strange reluctance to reclaim the vehicle. The car represented everything she was supposed to return to the lawyers, the custody battle, the endless demands of running a technology empire. Graham pulled up beside the Mercedes and put his truck in park. "Want me to take a look under the hood? See what the problem is?" Alexandra climbed out of the truck, the twins following like small shadows. The Mercedes was locked, of course, and her keys were somewhere back in New York, along with her purse, her phone, and her carefully organized life. "The keys are probably in my bag," she said, peering through the passenger window. "Which is probably still at the restaurant where I left it last night." "That's in New York?" Graham asked. "Manhattan, yes." Alexandra realized how far she'd driven in her panicked state. "I must have been driving for hours without realizing it." Graham was quiet for a moment, processing this information. "That's a long way to drive when you're upset. You must have been pretty shaken up." Before Alexandra could respond, her reflection in the car window was joined by another man in a dark suit walking across the parking lot toward them. Her blood ran cold as she recognized the purposeful stride and calculating expression of Marcus's head of security. "Mrs. Pierce," the man called out, his voice carrying clearly across the asphalt, "Mr. Whitmore has been very concerned about you and the children." Alexandra instinctively moved closer to Theo and Rosie, who pressed against her legs. She could feel Graham tense beside her, his contractor's instincts apparently extending to recognizing potential threats. "How did you find us?" Alexandra asked, though she suspected she already knew. The Mercedes probably had GPS tracking. Marcus was thorough about protecting his investments, and he'd always considered her and the children to be investments. "We've been looking all night," the security guard continued, ignoring her question. "Mr. Whitmore is prepared to be reasonable about this incident, but he needs you to return to New York immediately. The custody hearing has been moved up to Friday." Friday, 3 days away. Alexandra's lawyer had told her they'd have at least 2 weeks to prepare for the hearing, but Marcus had obviously used his influence to accelerate the timeline. "What custody hearing?" Graham asked quietly, his voice carrying an undertone Alexandra hadn't heard before, something protective and slightly dangerous. The security guard's attention shifted to Graham for the first time, taking in the work clothes, the weathered hands, the small-town surroundings. His expression suggested he was calculating Graham's threat level and finding it minimal. "Family matter," the guard said dismissively. "Mrs. Pierce, the car is ready. We can leave immediately." "I don't want to go," Rosie said suddenly, her small voice cutting through the tension. "I want to stay with Maya and her daddy." "Sweetheart," Alexandra began, but Theo interrupted. "Why can't we live here? Maya's daddy doesn't yell, and he makes pancakes, and Maya can teach us music." The security guard's patience was clearly wearing thin. "Mrs. Pierce, I have orders to bring you back, willingly or not." That's when Graham stepped forward. His movement was subtle but decisive, positioning himself between the guard and Alexandra's family. When he spoke, his voice was calm but carried absolute authority. "I think you're confused about something," Graham said evenly. "This lady and her children are guests in my town. If they want to leave, that's their choice. But nobody's going to be forced to do anything they don't want to do." Alexandra stared at Graham in amazement. Here was a man she'd known for less than 12 hours, standing up to someone who represented Marcus's considerable power and influence. The security guard clearly hadn't expected resistance from a small-town handyman. "Sir, this doesn't concern you," the guard said, his tone hardening. "I suggest you step aside." "Actually, it concerns me quite a bit," Graham replied, not moving an inch. "See, when someone shows up in my town and starts making threats, that becomes my business pretty quickly." Alexandra realized she was at a crossroads. She could get in the Mercedes, return to New York, and face the custody hearing with whatever legal protection her team could provide. It was the sensible choice, the expected choice, or she could make a decision that might change everything. "I'm not going back," she said quietly. The words surprised even her. She'd built her life on careful planning, strategic thinking, calculated risks. This wasn't calculated, it was pure instinct. "Ma'am, I really must insist," the guard began. "You heard the lady?" Graham interrupted. "She's not going." Neither are her children. I suggest you head back to wherever you came from and tell Mr. Whitmore that Mrs. Pierce is exactly where she wants to be." For a moment, Alexandra thought the security guard might try to force the issue. But something in Graham's stance, the relaxed confidence of someone who'd faced down bigger threats than one overpaid corporate security guard, seemed to give him pause. "This isn't over," the guard said finally, pulling out his phone. "Mr. Whitmore will hear about this." "I'm sure he will," Graham replied pleasantly. "Drive safe now." As the guard walked away, Alexandra felt her legs go weak with relief and terror in equal measure. She'd just made a decision that would have enormous consequences, but for the first time in months, it felt like her decision to make. "You okay?" Graham asked, his voice gentle again. "I think I just declared war on my ex-husband," Alexandra said shakily. "He has more lawyers than this town has people, and he's not going to just let this go." "Maybe not," Graham agreed. "But sometimes you have to draw a line and decide what's worth fighting for." Maya had been unusually quiet during the confrontation, but now she spoke up. "Are you really going to stay in Millbrook?" Alexandra looked down at her children, who were watching her with hope and trust in their eyes. Then she looked at Graham, this unexpected guardian angel who'd appeared in her darkest moment. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she admitted. "My apartment in New York belongs to the company, which Marcus controls now. My assets are all tied up in legal proceedings. Last night I was running on pure panic, but now you need a place to stay while you figure things out," Graham finished. "My cabin's not much, but it's got a spare room, and it's completely off the grid. No corporate tracking, no lawyers, no photographers, just peace and quiet." The offer was so generous, so completely unexpected, that Alexandra felt tears threatening again. "I can't impose on you like that. You don't even know me." "I know enough," Graham said simply. "I know you love your kids enough to drive 6 hours in a panic to keep them safe. I know you're running from something that scares you more than trusting a stranger, and I know that right now you need help. Besides," Maya added with a grin, "someone needs to teach the twins about music, and Dad could use help figuring out that orchestra program stuff. I bet you're good at organizing things." Alexandra laughed, despite everything a real laugh that felt like it came from somewhere she'd forgotten existed. "I am pretty good at organizing things." "Then it's settled," Graham said, leading them back to his truck. "Let's go home." As they drove away from the truck stop and the abandoned Mercedes, Alexandra watched the Nebraska landscape roll past the windows. She was making a choice that defied every practical instinct she'd developed in 20 years of business, but it felt more right than anything she'd done in months. For the first time since Marcus had filed for custody, she wasn't running from something. She was running toward it. Graham's cabin sat 3 miles outside Millbrook proper, nestled in a grove of oak trees that provided natural privacy from the county road. As they pulled into the gravel driveway, Alexandra felt her breath catch. The small log structure looked like something from a storybook-weathered cedar logs, a stone chimney sending up a lazy curl of smoke, and a wraparound porch with 2 rocking chairs positioned to catch the morning sun. "It's not much," Graham said, cutting the engine and seeming suddenly self-conscious. "Built it myself on weekends over about 3 years. Sarah always said it was her favorite place in the world." "It's beautiful," Alexandra said, and meant it. After years of living in sleek Manhattan penthouses and sterile corporate housing, the cabin's humble authenticity felt like a revelation. The twins were out of the truck before Graham had fully engaged the parking brake, racing toward the porch with the fearless enthusiasm of children who'd discovered a new playground. Maya followed more sedately, but Alexandra could see excitement in her careful composure. "Can we go inside?" Rosie called back. "It looks like where the 3 bears live." "Hopefully without the bears," Graham laughed, fishing keys from his pocket, "though we do get the occasional deer family in the backyard." The cabin's interior was as charming as its exterior. The main room combined living area and kitchen, with exposed beam ceilings and a fieldstone fireplace that dominated one wall. Everything was clean and well-maintained, but Alexandra could see the careful economy in the furnishings. A couch that had been reupholstered rather than replaced, kitchen cabinets that showed the wear of daily use, braided rugs that had clearly been chosen for durability over fashion. What struck her most was how much love lived in this space. Photographs covered every available surface, Maya at various ages, always with her violin, a beautiful woman with dark hair who must have been Sarah, Graham in military uniform, looking impossibly young. There were handmade crafts that Maya had obviously created over the years, a bookshelf stuffed with everything from technical manuals to children's classics, and a corner dedicated to Maya's music with a piano that had seen better days but was obviously well-tuned. "The spare room's through here," Graham said, leading Alexandra down a short hallway. "It's small, but there's a double bed and a dresser. Maya and I can share my room for a few days if needed, or we can set up sleeping bags in the main room for the kids." "I can't let you give up your bed," Alexandra protested. "The couch will be fine for me." "Absolutely not," Graham said firmly. "You and the twins take the bedroom. Maya and I are used to camping out when we have guests." "When do you have guests?" Maya asked, appearing in the doorway with Theo and Rosie in tow. "We never have guests." Graham ruffled his daughter's hair affectionately. "Well, maybe it's time we started." The afternoon passed in a blur of domestic activity that felt surreal to Alexandra. While Graham went back to town to finish the previous night's streetlight repairs, Maya took charge of settling their unexpected house guests. She showed the twins where the bathroom was, explained how the wood stove worked, and set up an impromptu art station at the kitchen table with construction paper and crayons. Alexandra found herself trying to help but quickly realized how little she knew about basic household management. In New York, she had a housekeeper, a personal assistant, and a nanny. Meals appeared when ordered, laundry vanished and returned clean and pressed, and her primary domestic responsibility was choosing what to wear each day. "Do you know how to make hot cocoa?" Maya asked, studying Alexandra with curious eyes. Alexandra paused, embarrassed. "I know how to order it from a cafe." Maya's expression was matter-of-fact rather than judgmental. "That's okay. Lots of grown-ups don't know how to cook. Dad taught me because he said everyone should know how to take care of themselves." Under Maya's patient instruction, Alexandra learned to heat milk on the stove without scorching it, how much cocoa powder to add for the perfect sweetness, and the secret ingredient that made Graham's version speciale, tiny pinch of cinnamon. "Dad says cooking is like music," Maya explained as they worked. "You have to pay attention to what you're doing and feel when it's right." The cocoa was perfect, rich and warming, and Alexandra felt an absurd pride in having made it herself. The twins pronounced it better than Starbucks, which made Maya beam with satisfaction. As evening approached, Graham returned with groceries and the news that he'd arranged for a friend to tow Alexandra's Mercedes to a secure garage. "Carl's going to look it over tomorrow," he said, unloading bags of food onto the kitchen counter. "But even if it's fine mechanically, you probably don't want to be driving something that's easy to track." The practical reminder of her situation sent a chill through Alexandra. In the peaceful bubble of the cabin, she'd almost forgotten about Marcus, the custody battle, and the corporate empire that was probably in chaos without her. "I should call my lawyer," she said. "Let him know where I am." "Should you?" Graham asked mildly. "Or would that make it easier for people to find you before you're ready to be found?" Alexandra considered this. Her lawyer, James Morrison, was brilliant and dedicated, but he was also part of a system that valued predictability and conventional solutions. He would undoubtedly advise her to return to New York immediately, to fight the custody battle through proper legal channels, to trust in the justice system despite its obvious bias toward Marcus's wealth and influence. "Maybe I should wait," she said slowly, "just for a day or two, until I can think clearly." "That sounds wise," Graham agreed. "In the meantime, how about we focus on dinner? I picked up ingredients for spaghetti and meatballs, Maya's favorite." Cooking dinner became a group effort that felt more like a celebration than a meal preparation. Maya taught the twins how to measure ingredients for meatballs, while Alexandra learned to brown ground beef without burning it. Graham handled the pasta with the confidence of someone who'd been feeding a family on his own for years. In my house in New York, Theo announced while carefully rolling tiny meatballs, the cook makes all the food and we're not allowed in the kitchen because we might make a mess. That's silly, Maya said. The best part of cooking is getting a little messy. Besides, food tastes better when you help make it. Why? Rosie asked, her face serious with 5-year-old curiosity. Because you put love into it? Maya explained, as if this were obvious. Dad taught me that. When you cook for people you care about, the love gets mixed in with all the other ingredients. Alexandra felt something shift in her chest at Maya's simple wisdom. When had she stopped putting love into the daily acts of living? When had everything become so efficient, so managed, so removed from the actual experience of being alive? After dinner, while Graham washed dishes and the twins colored at the table, Alexandra found herself on the porch, breathing in the crisp evening air and listening to the sounds of rural Nebraska settling into night. No traffic, no sirens, no constant electronic hum of city life. Just whined through the oak trees and the distant lowing of cattle from a neighboring farm. Maya joined her on the porch steps, violin case in hand. Dad says you should always practice outside when the weather's nice, Maya explained. He says music sounds better when it has room to grow. As Maya began to play something soft and contemplative that Alexandra didn't recognize, he felt the last of her urban tension begin to dissolve. The music seemed to blend with the natural evening sounds, creating a symphony that was both peaceful and profound. That was beautiful, Alexandra said when the last note faded. What was it? Something I made up, Maya said shyly. I call it the Song for Finding Home. I wrote it after we moved here from town. Sometimes when you're lost, you don't know you've been found until you stop running. The insight was so mature, so perfectly apt to Alexandra's situation, that she had to blink back tears. You're a very wise young lady. Dad says wisdom comes from paying attention to what really matters, Maya replied. Most people are too busy to notice. When they went back inside, they found Graham helping the twins brush their teeth with spare toothbrushes he'd apparently bought in town. The domestic scene was so normal, so comfortable, that Alexandra had to remind herself she'd only known these people for 24 hours. That night, as she lay in the unfamiliar bed with Theo and Rosie curled on either side of her, Alexandra reflected on the day. She'd learned to make hot cocoa, helped cook dinner, and listened to a 12-year-old play violin under the stars. Such simple activities, but they felt more meaningful than most of the high-stakes business meetings that usually filled her days. For the first time in years, she fell asleep without checking her phone, without reviewing tomorrow's schedule, without the anxiety that had become her constant companion. Instead, she drifted off to the sound of wind in the oak trees and the steady breathing of her children, finally safe and at peace. 3 days into their stay at the cabin, Alexandra stood in the kitchen at 6 in the morning, staring at a handwritten grocery list that might as well have been written in a foreign language. Milk, 2%, bread, whole wheat, eggs, large. She read aloud, marveling at the specificity required for something she'd never had to think about before. Graham emerged from the back bedroom, hair still messed from sleep, carrying an armload of clothes that needed washing. "You're up early," he observed, accepting the coffee she'd managed to make without his help, a small victory that still filled her with disproportionate pride. "In New York, I'm usually at the office by 5:30, Alexandra said, then caught herself. "I was usually at the office by 5:30. I'm not sure what my schedule is anymore." "Maybe that's not such a bad thing," Graham suggested gently. "When's the last time you didn't have a schedule?" Alexandra tried to remember and couldn't. Even as a child, her days had been carefully planned piano lessons, language tutors, academic preparation programs designed to ensure she'd be ready to take over her father's company someday. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd spent her entire life preparing for the success that was now being used to argue she was an unfit mother. "I honestly can't remember," she admitted. "Well, today your only job is to figure out what you want for breakfast," Graham said, pulling eggs from the refrigerator. "Everything else can wait." The simple declaration felt revolutionary. Alexandra had built Pierce Technologies by never letting anything wait, by treating every delay as a potential competitive disadvantage. But sitting in Graham's kitchen, watching him move with unhurried competence as he prepared scrambled eggs, she wondered what she'd been racing toward all these years. Maya appeared in the doorway, violin case in one hand and a backpack in the other, ready for school. Behind her, Theo and Rosie stumbled sleepily into the kitchen, still wearing the oversized t-shirts they'd been using as pajamas. "Dad, can Alexandra come to my school concert Friday night?" Maya asked, settling into her usual chair. "Mrs. Patterson said parents and family could come, and I thought—" She paused, suddenly uncertain. "I mean, if you want to, you don't have to." The invitation caught Alexandra off guard. She'd attended countless corporate galas and charity events, but she couldn't remember the last time someone had invited her to something simply because they wanted her there. "I would love to come," Alexandra said, meaning it completely. "What will you be playing?" Maya's face lit up. "Bach's Air on the G string. It's really hard, but Mrs. Patterson thinks I'm ready for it. Dad's been helping me with the timing." "I don't know much about timing," Graham said modestly, "but I know what sounds right." After Maya left for school, Graham showed Alexandra how to change a tire on his pickup trucker skill. She realized might become essential if she was going to stay off the grid. Her first attempt was clumsy and inefficient, but Graham was patient, letting her struggle with the lug wrench until she figured out the proper leverage. In business school, they teach you to delegate tasks to people with specialized skills, Alexandra said, finally succeeding in loosening a stubborn bolt. "This is the first time I've ever actually fixed something myself." "How does it feel?" Graham asked. Alexandra considered the question seriously. Her hands were dirty, her back ached from crouching beside the truck, and she'd managed to skin her knuckles on the wheel well. It should have been unpleasant, but instead she felt oddly satisfied. "Competent," she said finally, "like I accomplished something real." "That's because you did," Graham said simply. They spent the afternoon working on various small projects around the cabin. Graham was refinishing an old dresser for Maya's room, sanding away years of wear to reveal the beautiful oak grain beneath. Alexandra found herself drawn to the meditative rhythm of the work, the way each stroke of sandpaper revealed a little more of the wood's hidden character. "Sarah picked this piece out at an estate sale when Maya was still a baby," Graham said, pausing to run his hand over the smooth wood. "She had an eye for seeing potential in things other people had given up on." "She sounds like she was wonderful," Alexandra said carefully. She'd noticed how Graham spoke about his late wife with love and sadness, but without the bitter edge that colored her own thoughts about Marcus. "She was," Graham agreed. "Sarah had this way of making everyone feel like they were exactly where they belonged." Maya inherited that gift. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Maya burst through the front door, backpack flying, face flushed with excitement. "Dad, guess what happened at school today?" "What happened, sweetheart?" "Mr. Henderson, you know, from the music store, he heard about the regional orchestra, and he wants to sponsor my participation. He's going to cover the travel costs and everything." Graham's face transformed with relief and joy. Alexandra could see how much the financial pressure had been weighing on him, even though he'd never complained about it in front of Maya. "That's incredible, honey. Did you thank him properly?" "Of course I did. But Dad," Maya's expression became more serious, "he wants me to perform at the store's anniversary celebration next month. Like a real performance in front of a big audience. Do you think I'm ready for that?" Graham knelt down to Maya's level, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. "I think you're ready for anything you set your mind to, but more importantly, what do you think?" Maya considered this with the thoughtfulness that seemed to characterize all her decisions. "I think I'm scared, but also excited. Is that normal?" "That's exactly normal," Alexandra interjected, surprised by her own certainty. "The best opportunities usually come with equal parts, fear and excitement. That's how you know they're worth pursuing." Both Graham and Maya looked at her with interest, and Alexandra realized she'd spoken from a place of hard-won experience. "When I started my company," she continued, "I was terrified. I was 23 years old, competing against people with decades more experience. But I was also excited about the possibility of building something meaningful. The fear meant it mattered." "Did the fear ever go away?" Maya asked. "Not completely," Alexandra admitted. "But it changed from being afraid of failing to being afraid of not trying hard enough. That's a much better kind of fear." That evening, after dinner and homework and Maya's practice time, the twins were playing a complicated game involving blocks and elaborate stories when Rosie suddenly looked up at Alexandra. "Are we going to live here forever?" she asked, with 5-year-old directness. The question hung in the air. Alexandra realized that while she'd been learning to make cocoa and change tires, she'd been avoiding the larger question of what came next. The custody hearing was still looming. Marcus's lawyers were undoubtedly preparing their case. Her company was probably struggling without her daily oversight. But looking around the cabinet, Graham reading a woodworking magazine by the fire, at Maya helping Theo build an elaborate block castle, at Rosie, curled against her side, like a contented kitten, Alexandra felt something she'd almost forgotten existed. Peace, belonging, the simple satisfaction of being exactly where she was supposed to be. "I don't know about forever," Alexandra said honestly, "but I know I want to stay here as long as we can." "Good," Rosie said, matter-of-factly, returning to her blocks. "I like it here. Nobody yells, and Graham makes the best pancakes, and Maya teaches us songs." Later, after the children were in bed, Alexandra found herself on the porch again with Graham. They'd fallen into this evening routine without discussing it, a quiet hour of conversation while the day settled into night around them. "Can I ask you something?" Alexandra said, wrapping one of Sarah's quilts around her shoulders against the cool air. "Of course. Why are you helping us? Really, I mean. You don't know anything about me, about my situation. For all you know, I could be running from something I actually did wrong." Graham was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful and measured. "When Sarah was sick," he said finally, "people helped us in ways I never could have expected. Neighbors brought casseroles. Maya's teacher arranged for extra tutoring when I had to take Sarah to appointments. The pastor's wife babysat, so I could spend nights at the hospital. None of them asked questions or expected anything in return. They just saw people who needed help and decided to help." He paused, looking out at the darkness beyond the porch light. "After Sarah died, I felt like I owed a debt to the world to pay forward all that kindness. But it was more than that. Helping you and the twins doesn't feel like charity. It feels like," he struggled for the right words, "like finding something I didn't know I was looking for." Alexandra felt her throat tighten with emotion. "What were you looking for?" "Purpose, maybe, or just proof that good things can still happen randomly, that kindness isn't extinct." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds and watching stars appear in the clear Nebraska sky. Alexandra found herself thinking about the grocery list from that morning, about the satisfaction of changing a tire, about Maya's upcoming performance, and the way Theo had laughed when Graham taught him to whistle. Simple things, small moments. But they added up to something larger than the sum of their parts, a sense of belonging that all her corporate success had never provided. "Graham," she said quietly. "Yeah? Thank you for reminding me what home feels like." In the darkness, she could hear him smile. "Thank you for reminding me that sometimes the best things happen when you're not looking for them." The Millbrook Elementary School auditorium was exactly what Alexandra had expected from a small, rural school, modest, functional, and filled with the kind of community pride that money couldn't manufacture. Folding chairs arranged in neat rows, a small stage with heavy burgundy curtains, and the slightly musty smell of a building that had hosted decades of Christmas pageants and graduation ceremonies. What she hadn't expected was how nervous she would feel walking in as Maya's guest. Alexandra had delivered keynote speeches to audiences of thousands, had testified before congressional committees, had negotiated deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But sitting in the third row of a small-town school auditorium while other parents chatted around her, she felt conspicuously out of place. "You're Maya Ellis's family," said a woman in the seat beside her, not really asking. "I'm Carol Patterson, her music teacher. That girl is something special." Alexandra felt a warm flush of pride at being identified as Maya's family, even though it wasn't technically accurate. "She is remarkable. We're so proud of her. Graham's done an incredible job raising her on his own," Mrs. Patterson continued. "After Sarah passed, a lot of us worried about how they'd manage. But that little girl has flourished. Music has been her way of honoring her mother's memory while building her own identity." Before Alexandra could respond, the lights dimmed and a nervous-looking principal took the stage to introduce the evening's program. Alexandra found Graham's hand in the darkness and squeezed it, surprised by how natural the gesture felt. When Maya appeared on stage, violin in hand, Alexandra felt her breath catch. The 12-year-old girl looked poised and confident, but Alexandra could see the slight tremor in her hands that betrayed her nerves. Maya found them in the audience, smiled, and seemed to draw strength from their presence. The first notes of Bach's Air on the G string filled the small auditorium, and Alexandra was transported. She'd heard the piece performed by world-class musicians in prestigious concert halls, but she'd never heard it played with such pure emotion. Maya's technique was still developing, but her interpretation was flawless, each phrase shaped with understanding that seemed far beyond her years. Around them, the audience sat in rapt silence. Alexandra noticed Mrs. Henderson from the post office wiping away tears. Mr. Carson, who ran the hardware store, had stopped rustling through his program to listen completely. Even the kindergartners in the front row, who'd been fidgeting through the earlier performances, were still and attentive. When the last note faded, the silence stretched for a heartbeat before erupting into enthusiastic applause. Maya curtsied gracefully, her face glowing with accomplishment and relief, and Alexandra felt such fierce pride that she understood, for the first time, what it meant to be a parent in the truest sense. After the concert, they were surrounded by community members offering congratulations and praise. Alexandra watched Graham accept the accolades with quiet pride, deflecting credit to Maya while clearly basking in his daughter's success. This was what family looked like. She realized not the sterile, strategic relationships she'd grown up with, but this warm, supportive network that celebrated each other's victories as their own. "You must be the lady staying with Graham and Maya," said an elderly man with kind eyes and weathered hands. "I'm Pastor Williams from St. Mark's. Graham's told me wonderful things about you and your children." "Thank you for letting us use the church hall that first night," Alexandra said. "It made all the difference." "That's what community is for," Pastor Williams replied. "We take care of each other. Graham's been doing that for years. About time someone took care of him for a change." The comment stayed with Alexandra as they drove home through the quiet streets of Millbrook. She'd been so focused on what Graham and Maya were giving her: shelter, kindness, a sense of belonging, that she hadn't considered what she might be offering them in return. Back at the cabin, while Graham helped the twins get ready for bed, Alexandra found Maya in the kitchen, carefully placing her violin back in its case. "You were absolutely magnificent tonight," Alexandra said. "I've heard that piece performed many times, but never with such heart." Maya blushed, but looked pleased. It felt different tonight, like Mom was there, listening. "I'm sure she was," Alexandra said softly. "Music has a way of connecting us across any distance." "Alexandra?" Maya's voice was suddenly uncertain. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Are you going to leave us?" The question was asked with the careful casualness of someone who'd learned not to expect permanence, and it broke Alexandra's heart a little. "Why do you ask?" Maya fidgeted with the clasps on her violin case. "Dad's been happier since you've been here. He laughs more, and he doesn't get that worried look when he thinks I'm not watching. But people always leave eventually. Mom didn't want to, but she did. And I know you have a whole other life somewhere else." Alexandra sat down beside Maya, choosing her words carefully. "You're right that I have a complicated situation to figure out. But what you need to know is that these past few days with you and your father have been the happiest I've been in years. Whatever happens, that's not going to change. But you will have to go back eventually, won't you? To your real life? Maya, can I tell you something I've learned recently? Sometimes what we think is our real life isn't real at all. Sometimes it takes finding something authentic to realize how much we've been pretending. Before Maya could respond, they heard the front door open and voices on the porch. But these weren't the familiar sounds of Graham returning from an evening walk. These were urgent, official voices that made Alexandra's blood run cold. Through the kitchen window, she could see the flashing lights of police cars in the driveway. "Mrs. Pierce." The voice calling from outside was authoritative and carried easily through the cabin's thin walls. "This is Sheriff Davidson. We need to speak with you." Alexandra's stomach dropped. Somehow, despite all their precautions, Marcus had found them. But how? And what legal authority did he have in Nebraska? Graham appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face grim. "There are 3 cars out there," he said quietly. "Sheriff, 2 deputies, and a man in a suit, who's definitely not local law enforcement." "Should we?" Maya started, but Alexandra shook her head. "No, whatever this is about, I won't have you and your father involved in my problems." She stood up, squaring her shoulders the way she did before difficult board meetings. "I'll handle this." But Graham was already moving toward the door. "We're all involved now," he said simply. "That's what family does." The word family hit Alexandra like a physical blow. In the space of a week, this man and his daughter had claimed her in a way that felt more real than any legal document or corporate relationship she'd ever signed. Outside, Sheriff Davidson was a tall, lean man in his 50s, with the patient demeanor of someone who dealt with every kind of small-town crisis imaginable. Beside him stood Marcus's head legal counsel, Richard Thornton, a man Alexandra recognized and had always disliked for his willingness to use the law as a weapon rather than a tool for justice. "Mrs. Pierce," Thornton said smoothly, "you've been very difficult to locate." "I wasn't aware I was lost," Alexandra replied evenly. "There's a custody hearing scheduled for tomorrow morning in New York," Thornton continued. "Your absence has been noted by the court. Judge Harrison is not pleased." Tomorrow. Alexandra's mind raced. The hearing had been moved up again, clearly designed to catch her unprepared and without proper legal representation. "Sheriff Davidson," Graham said, stepping slightly forward, "what exactly is the nature of this visit? Are there charges being filed?" The sheriff looked uncomfortable. "No charges, Mr. Ellis, but there is a court order requiring Mrs. Pierce to appear for a custody hearing. Failure to comply could result in contempt charges." "And if she chooses to contest the jurisdiction?" Graham asked. His voice was calm, but Alexandra caught something in his tone, familiarity with legal procedures that surprised her. Thornton's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Ellis, this is a family matter that doesn't concern you." "Actually," Graham replied, his voice taking on an edge Alexandra had never heard before, "when you show up at my home with police officers to intimidate my guests, it very much concerns me." For a moment, the 2 men stared at each other, Thornton with his expensive suit and calculated aggression, Graham with his work clothes and quiet, absolute confidence. Alexandra could feel the tension crackling between them. "The children are inside sleeping," Alexandra said finally. "Whatever this is about, I won't have them frightened." "The children are precisely what this is about," Thornton replied. "They belong with their father, in a stable environment, not hiding in some rural cabin with strangers." Before Alexandra could respond, Maya's voice cut through the night air from the porch. "They're not strangers," she said clearly, moving to stand beside her father. "They're family." The simple declaration from a 12-year-old carried more weight than any legal argument Thornton could have made. Sheriff Davidson shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing that this situation was more complex than a simple custody dispute. "Sheriff," Alexandra said, making a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary, "I appreciate you making the drive out here, but I'm going to need some time to consult with my attorney before I can respond to any court orders." "Mrs. Pierce," Thornton warned. Judge Harrison has made it clear that any further delays will not be tolerated. Then Judge Harrison will have to hold me in contempt, Alexandra replied, because I'm not going anywhere until I'm certain my children will be safe. As the official vehicles finally pulled away, leaving tire tracks in the gravel driveway, Alexandra stood on the porch with Graham and Maya, watching the red taillights disappear into the darkness. "You just declared war on your ex-husband," Graham observed quietly. "I think I declared war on him the moment I chose to stay here instead of going back," Alexandra replied. "Now we find out what that choice is really going to cost." But standing there with Graham's steady presence beside her and Maya's fierce loyalty surrounding them both, Alexandra realized that some things were worth any price. The first photograph appeared online at 6:47 a.m., posted to a celebrity gossip blog with the headline, "Tech Billionaire's Secret Rural Romance." Alexandra Pierce found shacked up with small-town handyman. Alexandra discovered it when she made the mistake of checking her email on Graham's old laptop, hoping to find a message from her lawyer. Instead, she found her life dissected by strangers. The photo had been taken with a telephoto lens, probably from the county road. It showed her and Graham on the cabin's front porch the previous evening, his hand resting gently on her shoulder as they watched Maya practice violin in the yard. The image was innocent enough, but the accompanying article painted a lurid picture of a billionaire mother abandoning her responsibilities for a romantic fling with a rugged contractor. "They make it sound like I'm having some kind of midlife crisis," Alexandra said, showing Graham the laptop screen as he sat down with his morning coffee. Graham read the article in silence, his expression growing increasingly grim. "This is going to get worse before it gets better," he said finally. "Once one outlet picks up the story, they all will." He was right. By noon, there were 3 more articles, each more sensational than the last, from boardroom to barn. Alexandra Pierce's dramatic fall from grace. Pierce Technologies stock plummets as CEO goes missing. Custody battle turns ugly. Billionaire mom chooses love over children. That last headline made Alexandra's hands shake with rage. The article quoted unnamed sources close to Marcus, painting her as an unfit mother who'd chosen a romantic relationship over her children's welfare. It was character assassination disguised as journalism. "We need to get you back to New York," said James Morrison, her lawyer, when she finally reached him by phone. "Every day you stay away gives Whitmore's team more ammunition. The judge is already questioning your commitment to the custody proceedings." "What about my commitment to my children's safety and happiness?" Alexandra shot back. "They've been more stable in the past week than they've been in months." "That's not how the court is going to see it," Morrison replied. "You're hiding in Nebraska with a man you've known for a week. From a legal perspective, it looks exactly as bad as Whitmore's lawyers are claiming." Alexandra looked out the kitchen window, where Graham was teaching Theo and Rosie how to identify different types of birds at the feeder he'd built. Maya sat nearby, practicing scales on her violin. The scene was so peaceful, so normal, that it felt like looking at a different world from the one Morrison was describing. "James, I need you to file for a change of venue," she said suddenly. "Nebraska courts, Nebraska jurisdiction." "Alexandra, is it possible?" Morrison was quiet for a moment. "Theoretically, yes, if you can establish residency and argue that the children's best interests are served by staying in Nebraska. But it's a long shot, and it would take time we don't have." "Then we make time," Alexandra said. "Do whatever you need to do." After ending the call, Alexandra found Graham in his workshop, a converted shed behind the cabin where he built furniture and repaired the various mechanical things that kept their rural life functioning. He was sanding a piece of maple with methodical precision, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "The reporters called Maya's school," he said, without looking up from his work. "Principal Martinez had to send her home early. Someone was asking the kids questions about us." The violation felt like a physical blow. They brought children into this. Maya's just a little girl. "Maya's tough," Graham said, finally meeting her eyes. "But this isn't fair to her. She didn't sign up for any of this." Alexandra heard the unspoken question in his words. Are you sure this is worth it? Are we worth the damage this is going to cause? Graham, if you want us to leave, that's not what I'm saying, he interrupted gently. I'm saying we need to be prepared for how bad this might get. Your ex-husband has resources, connections, and apparently no scruples about using them. This is going to be a war, Alexandra. Are you ready for that? Before she could answer, Maya appeared in the workshop doorway, backpack still slung over her shoulder, face flushed with anger rather than embarrassment. Dad, some reporter lady asked Jenny Morrison if I knew where the twins' real father was, Maya announced. So I told her that you're more of a real father to those kids in 1 week than most men are in a lifetime. Graham's face went through several expressions: pride, concern, and something that might have been love. Maya, sweetheart, you can't talk to reporters. They'll twist whatever you say. Let them, Maya said fiercely. Everyone in this town knows what kind of man you are. Let them try to make us look bad. That evening, as if summoned by the media attention, more unwelcome visitors arrived. This time it was Beth Crawford, a social worker from the Nebraska Department of Children and Family Services, accompanied by Dr. Helen Martinez, a child psychologist who specialized in custody evaluations. We've received a request from New York Family Court to conduct a welfare assessment, Ms. Crawford explained, settling into Graham's living room with a clipboard and the weary professionalism of someone who'd seen too many family situations go wrong. It's routine in interstate custody disputes. Routine for whom? Alexandra asked, though she tried to keep her tone civil. These women were just doing their jobs, even if those jobs were being weaponized by Marcus's legal team. The evaluation will involve interviews with all parties and observation of the children's living situation. Dr. Martinez added, we'll need to speak with each child individually, assess their emotional state, and determine whether their current environment is in their best interests. The next 3 hours were among the most stressful of Alexandra's life. She watched strangers evaluate every aspect of their makeshift family, taking notes on everything from the children's sleeping arrangements to the contents of the refrigerator. The twins were confused and frightened by the formal interviews, despite Dr. Martinez's attempts to make the process feel like a game. Why do they want to know if we're happy? Rosie whispered to Alexandra during a break. We are happy. Why isn't that enough? Sometimes grown-ups make things more complicated than they need to be, Alexandra replied, holding her daughter close. But you just tell them the truth about how you feel, okay? Maya's interview was last and longest. Through the closed bedroom door, Alexandra could hear the 12-year-old's clear voice, explaining her family's dynamics with the kind of emotional intelligence that Dr. Martinez was obviously noting. When they finally emerged, Maya looked drained but determined. She asked if I felt like you and the twins were taking advantage of Dad. Maya reported quietly. I told her that before you came, Dad was sad all the time, even when he was trying not to show it. I told her that now he smiles for real again. When the officials finally left, promising to file their report within 48 hours, the cabin felt violated somehow. They'd been forced to explain and justify what had felt natural and right, to reduce love to a series of checkbox evaluations. How do you think we did? Alexandra asked Graham as they cleaned up the coffee cups and scattered papers left behind by the assessment. I think, Graham said carefully, that they saw a stable, loving environment where children are thriving. But I also think your ex-husband's lawyers are very good at their jobs. That night, after the children were in bed, Alexandra found herself pacing the small living room, unable to settle. The walls that had felt cozy now seemed confining, and every sound outside made her wonder if more reporters or officials were approaching. I should go back, she said suddenly. End this before it gets worse. Fight the custody battle on his terms instead of dragging all of you through this. Graham looked up from the legal documents Morrison had faxed over motions and counter-motions that would determine where and how the custody hearing would proceed. Is that what you want? He asked. What I want doesn't matter anymore, Alexandra replied. This has gotten bigger than what I want. Alexandra, Graham said, standing and moving toward her. In all the years I was married to Sarah, through everything we went through her illness, the financial stress, the fear of losing everything, do you know what kept us going? She shook her head. The absolute certainty that we were better together than apart, that whatever we faced it together. He reached for her hands, holding them gently. I haven't felt that certainty since she died. Until now. The admission hung between them, honest and vulnerable and terrifying in its implications. Graham, if we do this, if we really fight this, it's going to get so much worse. The media attention, the legal scrutiny, the impact on Maya's life. Let me ask you something, Graham interrupted. A week ago, when you found yourself sitting on those theater steps with 2 sleeping children, what did you think was going to happen next? Alexandra remembered that moment, the desperation, the exhaustion, the feeling that she'd reached the end of every road she knew how to travel. I thought we were going to freeze to death, she said honestly. I thought I'd finally run out of options. And instead, I found you. You didn't find me, Graham corrected gently. We found each other, and we found something worth fighting for. Before Alexandra could respond, her phone buzzed with a text message. The number was unknown, but the message was clear. Enjoying your vacation? Court hearing moved to Monday. Hope your boyfriend is worth losing your kids over. M. The petty cruelty of it, the deliberate misspellings designed to seem casual while delivering maximum emotional damage, was so typically Marcus that Alexandra felt her resolve crystallize into something hard and sharp. You're right, she said, showing Graham the message. Some things are worth fighting for. The next morning, she called Morrison back with new instructions. File for the venue change. File for emergency custody orders. And James, I want you to hire the best private investigator you can find. If Marcus wants to play dirty, let's make sure we know everything there is to know about his life. By afternoon, they had their answer from Dr. Martinez's assessment. The children showed no signs of distress or instability. In fact, both twins demonstrated improved emotional regulation and increased feelings of security compared to their baseline evaluations from 6 months earlier. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was validation that what they'd built here was real, valuable, and worth defending. That evening, as they sat down to dinner, homemade soup and cornbread that Alexandra had learned to make without burning, Maya made an announcement. I've been thinking about what that social worker asked me, she said, cutting her cornbread with unusual precision. About whether this felt like a real family or just people pretending. She looked around the table at the faces that had become so dear to her, Graham's patient strength, Alexandra's growing confidence, the twins' infectious joy. I told her that real families aren't about who you're related to. They're about who shows up when you need them most. Alexandra felt her throat tighten with emotion. In all her years of corporate success, she'd never received recognition that meant as much as this 12-year-old's matter-of-fact acceptance. Maya's right, Graham said quietly, and whatever happens next, we show up for each other. Outside, the Nebraska wind was picking up, rattling the windows and reminding them that winter was coming. But inside the cabin, warmed by the wood stove and the certainty of belonging, they were ready for whatever storms lay ahead. The private investigator's report arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by secure courier to Morrison's office, and immediately forwarded to Alexandra via encrypted email. She was sitting at Graham's kitchen table, helping Rosie with a coloring book while Maya practiced violin in the next room, when her phone chimed with the notification. I need to take this, she told Graham, who was teaching Theo how to tie knots with a piece of rope. It's from my lawyer. What Alexandra expected to find was financial irregularities, maybe evidence of Marcus's vindictive nature, perhaps some leverage she could use in the custody negotiations. What she didn't expect was to discover that Graham Ellis was not at all who she thought he was. The file was thorough. Morrison had indeed hired the best investigator money could buy. 3 days of digging had uncovered Marcus's predictable secrets, a pattern of aggressive business practices that skirted ethical boundaries, 2 previous relationships that had ended with non-disclosure agreements, and a lifestyle that involved far more risk-taking than would be appropriate for someone seeking custody of young children. But buried in the supplementary background checks routine investigation of anyone connected to the case was a section titled Graham Michael Ellis, Military Service Record. Alexandra's hands began to shake as she read. Staff Sergeant Graham Ellis, United States Army Special Forces, 3 tours in Afghanistan. Decorated veteran with commendations for valor, leadership under fire, and exceptional service in classified operations. Recipient of the Bronze Star, Purple Heart, and Distinguished Service Cross. Honorable discharge following injuries sustained during Operation Silent Thunder, details classified. The man who made pancakes and taught children to whistle had spent 12 years as one of the military's most elite soldiers. Alexandra scrolled through pages of redacted documents, piecing together a picture that seemed impossible to reconcile with the gentle carpenter she'd come to know. Combat deployments to some of the most dangerous regions in the world. Leadership of classified missions that required security clearances she'd never heard of. Training in disciplines that sounded more like spy novels than real life. And then, at the end of the file, the piece that made everything else make heartbreaking sense. Sarah Ellis had died while Graham was deployed on his final mission. He'd requested emergency leave, but operational requirements had prevented his return until 3 days after her funeral. The trauma of losing his wife while he was thousands of miles away, unable to say goodbye, had led to what the military psychologists termed survivor's guilt with associated depression and anxiety disorders. His choice to leave active duty and become a small-town handyman wasn't random career change, it was deliberate retreat from a life that had cost him everything he valued most. Alexandra, Graham's voice came from the kitchen doorway. Everything okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. She looked up at this man, who'd saved her and her children, who made them feel safe and loved, who she'd thought she was beginning to understand. Instead, she'd been living with a stranger, someone whose idea of emergency repairs included diffusing improvised explosive devices and whose definition of taking care of people had once involved operations she couldn't even pronounce. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked quietly, turning the laptop screen toward him. Graham's face went very still as he read the first few lines of the report. She watched 12 years of carefully constructed civilian identity crack like ice under pressure. "How much did you read?" he asked. "Enough to know that you're not just a carpenter who volunteers at the church." Alexandra's voice was steady, but she could hear her own confusion beneath the words. "Graham, you were Special Forces. You have medals for things I can't even understand. Why did you let me think?" "Because that's not who I am anymore," Graham interrupted, his voice carrying a weight she'd never heard before. "That person, Staff Sergeant Ellis, is gone. He died in Afghanistan, along with his wife." Maya appeared in the doorway, violin still in hand, drawn by the tension in their voices. "Dad, what's wrong?" Graham looked at his daughter, and Alexandra could see the moment he realized that his carefully maintained secret was about to shatter the peaceful life he'd built for both of them. "Maya, could you take Theo and Rosie outside for a while? Maybe show them how to identify the different birds at the feeder." Maya hesitated, clearly sensing the gravity of whatever was happening between the adults, but she nodded and disappeared to collect the twins. When they were alone, Graham sat down across from Alexandra, his hands clasped tightly on the table. "What do you want to know?" he asked. "I want to know why you didn't trust me with the truth." Graham was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "Do you know what it's like to come home from war and have people treat you like either a hero or a damaged weapon? To have them assume that because you've seen combat, you're either someone to worship or someone to fear?" Alexandra thought about her own experiences with public perception, how her business success had made her simultaneously admired and resented, how people constantly made assumptions about who she was based on her wealth. "I think I understand something about being defined by other people's expectations," she said softly. "When Sarah died while I was deployed, I made a choice, Graham continued. I was going to come home and be the father Maya needed, not the soldier I'd been trained to be. I was going to build a life where violence and danger and classified missions didn't exist. Where the most complicated problem was a broken streetlight or a leaky roof. But Graham, your service, what you did, that's something to be proud of. Is it? Graham's laugh was bitter. I spent 12 years learning how to kill people efficiently. I was very good at it. I saved lives, completed missions, served my country with distinction, and while I was doing all of that, my wife was dying alone in a hospital room, calling my name. The raw pain in his voice made Alexandra's chest tighten. She was beginning to understand that Graham's retreat into small-town anonymity wasn't just career change, it was penance. You couldn't have known, she said gently. That's what the chaplain said. That's what the therapist said. That's what everyone said. Graham stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the yard where Maya was patiently explaining bird identification to two fascinated 5-year-olds. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it are different things. Is that why you help people? The volunteering taking us in, is it guilt? Graham considered the question seriously. It started as guilt. After Sarah died, I felt like I owed the world something for all the destruction I'd been part of. But it became something else. Purpose, maybe, or just proof that I could use my hands to build instead of destroy. Alexandra looked at the man she'd thought she was falling in love with and realized she was seeing him clearly for the first time. The competence that had attracted her, the way he moved through crisis with calm authority, the protective instincts that had made her feel safer than she'd felt in years, all of it made perfect sense now. The night you found us, she said slowly, the way you handled everything, that wasn't just natural kindness, was it? No, Graham admitted. That was 12 years of training to assess threats, secure objectives, and protect civilians. You and the twins were a mission, and I was good at missions. And now? Graham turned from the window to meet her eyes. Now you're not a mission anymore. He stopped, struggling with words. You're the reason I remember what it feels like to want something for myself instead of just trying to atone for the past. The admission hung between them, vulnerable and honest. Alexandra realized that while she'd been learning to trust him, he'd been learning to trust himself to believe he deserved happiness after years of carrying guilt like stones in his pockets. Graham, do you know what I see when I look at you? He shook his head. I see a man who chose to use everything he learned about protection and service to build a quiet, beautiful life for his daughter. I see someone who turns his skills toward healing instead of harming. I see a person who saved my family when we had nowhere else to turn. You see what you want to see, Graham said, but there was hope in his voice now. No, I see what's really there, a good man who's been punishing himself for choices he never really had. Outside, they could hear Maya teaching the twins a song about different types of birds. Her clear voice carried through the window, mixing with their laughter and the rustle of wind through the oak trees. There's something else, Alexandra said, looking back at the investigator's report. Something that changes everything about our legal situation. Graham raised an eyebrow questioningly. Your security clearance, it's still active, isn't it? Even though you're not actively serving. Inactive, but maintained, yes. Why? Alexandra felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Because Marcus has been arguing that I'm an unfit mother, partly based on my association with you, claiming you're an unknown quantity, possibly dangerous. But you're not unknown at all. You're a decorated veteran with top-secret clearance who's been thoroughly vetted by the United States government. Alexandra, I don't want my military service dragged into this. It's not about dragging it in, she said, her business strategist mind now working at full speed. It's about context. Marcus has been painting me as reckless for trusting a stranger with my children's safety. But you're not a stranger. You're exactly the kind of person any rational parent would trust to protect their children. Graham sat back down, understanding dawning in his expression. You want to use my background to counter his character assassination. I want to use the truth to show that my judgment isn't impaired, it's excellent. I found the safest possible place for my children to be. Before Graham could respond, Maya burst through the front door, twins in tow, all three children breathless with excitement. "Dad," Alexandra, "you have to come see, there's a whole family of deer in the backyard, and they're not scared of us at all." Looking at the three children, Maya's protective pride, Theo's wonder, Rosie's uninhibited joy, Alexandra realized something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't about hiding anymore, or running from Marcus's legal threats. This was about standing and fighting for something that was worth defending. "Come on," she said to Graham, closing the laptop and standing up. "Let's go see these deer. We can figure out the rest later." As they walked outside together, Graham's hand finding hers naturally, Alexandra felt a different kind of certainty settling in her chest. She'd spent the past week learning that love wasn't about perfect people or simple situations. It was about choosing to build something beautiful with whoever you found yourself beside when the world tried to knock you down. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, the person you found yourself beside turned out to be exactly who you'd been looking for, all along, even if neither of you had known what you were searching for until you found it. The courthouse wedding was scheduled for Friday at 2 o'clock exactly, 1 week before the emergency custody hearing that Marcus's lawyers had managed to expedite. Alexandra stood in front of the small mirror in Graham's bedroom, adjusting the simple cream-colored dress she'd purchased from Miller's department store on Main Street. It wasn't the designer gown she might have chosen for a second wedding, but it felt more honest somehow, more connected to the woman she was becoming. "Are you sure about this?" Morrison asked for the third time during their morning phone call. "Getting married 24 hours before a custody hearing is going to look calculated to the judge. Whitmore's team will argue that it's a desperate attempt to appear stable. James, I'm marrying Graham because I love him and because we're building a family together," Alexandra had replied patiently. "The timing is coincidental." But even as she said it, Alexandra knew the timing wasn't entirely coincidental. The marriage would provide legal standing for Graham to be involved in custody decisions, would demonstrate stability and commitment, and would make it much harder for Marcus to argue that she was having some sort of romantic crisis that made her unfit for motherhood. More importantly, it felt right. Standing in the small bedroom where she'd found peace for the first time in years, Alexandra realized that she wasn't just marrying Graham, she was choosing a life that valued love over money, connection over achievement, presence over productivity. "Knock, knock," Maya's voice came through the bedroom door. "Can I come in?" "Of course, sweetheart." Maya entered, carrying a small jewelry box, her expression unusually serious. "I have something for you," she said, opening the box to reveal a delicate pearl necklace. It was Mom's. Dad said she wore it when they got married. Alexandra felt her throat tighten. "Maya, that's incredibly sweet, but I couldn't buy it. Should be saved for you. Mom would want you to wear it," Maya said with the certainty that 12-year-olds could sometimes possess. "She would like knowing that something beautiful from her wedding was part of yours too." As Maya fastened the necklace around Alexandra's throat, both of them caught sight of their reflection in the mirror, the young girl carefully attending to the woman who was about to become her stepmother. The image was tender and profound, a quiet moment of acceptance and blessing. "Maya, you know this doesn't change anything about your relationship with your father, right? He'll always be yours first." "I know," Maya said softly, "but I've been thinking maybe having more people to love doesn't make the love smaller. Maybe it makes it bigger." Before Alexandra could respond to this wisdom, the sound of multiple car engines in the driveway interrupted the moment. Through the bedroom window, they could see vehicles arriving, not the single cars of friends coming to a wedding, but a convoy that suggested something more official and much less welcome. Graham's voice carried from the front porch, calm but with an undertone of steel. "Gentlemen, you're on private property. State your business." Alexandra and Maya hurried to the living room, where they found Graham standing in the doorway, effectively blocking access to the house. In the driveway were 2 black sedans, a news van, and Sheriff Davidson's patrol car. "Mrs. Pierce," called a voice she recognized as belonging to Thornton, Marcus's lawyer. "We have an emergency injunction from Judge Harrison." You're required to return to New York immediately with the children." Alexandra felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. An emergency injunction meant Marcus had convinced a judge that the children were in immediate danger, a legal nuclear option that would override all other considerations. "On what grounds?" Graham asked, his military bearing suddenly visible in the way he held himself. "Endangerment," Thornton replied smoothly. "New evidence has come to light regarding Mr. Ellis's background and psychological state. The court has determined that the children's welfare requires immediate intervention." Maya pressed closer to Alexandra's side, and they could hear Theo and Rosie stirring in the back bedroom where they'd been napping before the ceremony. "What evidence?" Alexandra demanded, stepping up beside Graham. Thornton held up a thick folder. Military records indicating a pattern of violent behavior, psychological evaluations noting PTSD and anger management issues, and testimony from unnamed sources regarding Mr. Ellis's current mental state. Alexandra felt rage building in her chest. Marcus hadn't just gone after her, he'd weaponized Graham's service record, twisted his heroism into a liability, and used his grief over Sarah's death as evidence of instability. "Those records are classified," Graham said quietly. "How did you obtain them?" "Mr. Whitmore has extensive connections in Washington," Thornton replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "When the welfare of children is at stake, certain information becomes available through proper channels." Before Graham could respond, the sound of additional vehicles approaching made everyone turn. But these weren't more official cars, they were pickup trucks, SUVs, and sedans that Alexandra recognized as belonging to Millbrook residents. Pastor Williams emerged from the first truck, followed by Mrs. Patterson from the school, the Hendersons from the hardware store, Carl from the garage, and at least 20 other people Alexandra had met during her time in town. They arranged themselves quietly but deliberately between Thornton's group and the house, not saying anything but making their presence unmistakably felt. "What's this?" Thornton asked, his confidence wavering slightly. "This," said Pastor Williams calmly, "is a wedding party. We're here to celebrate Graham and Alexandra's marriage. Unless you have a warrant for arrest, I suggest you let these folks get on with their ceremony." Sheriff Davidson stepped forward, looking uncomfortable. "Richard, I've known Graham Ellis for 8 years. He's never shown any signs of the behavior you're describing. Are you sure about these allegations?" "The court has made its determination," Thornton replied, but Alexandra could see him reassessing the situation. What had been planned as a simple extraction was turning into a public confrontation with an entire community. "Actually," said a new voice, "the court has done no such thing." Everyone turned to see James Morrison approaching from a rental car, carrying a briefcase and wearing the satisfied expression of a lawyer who'd just won a significant victory. "James," Alexandra called out, "what are you doing here?" "Bringing good news," Morrison replied, pulling documents from his briefcase. "Judge Harrison has vacated the emergency injunction. Seems your ex-husband's lawyers made some significant procedural errors in their filing." Thornton's face went pale. "That's impossible. I spoke with the judge's clerk this morning." "You spoke with a clerk?" "Yes," Morrison agreed pleasantly. "But you failed to serve proper notice to opposing counsel, failed to provide adequate evidence for emergency intervention, and most importantly failed to disclose that your so-called evidence was obtained through potentially illegal means." Morrison turned to address the crowd that had gathered. "It seems Mr. Whitmore's people hacked into sealed military records. The Pentagon takes a very dim view of that sort of thing." Graham's expression shifted from defensive to amazed. "The Pentagon is involved?" "Oh, yes," Morrison continued. "Turns out, when you mess with a decorated veteran's classified service record, certain federal agencies become very interested in your activities. Mr. Whitmore is currently being questioned by military investigators regarding his unauthorized access to sensitive information." Alexandra felt a surge of vindication so strong it was almost dizzying. Marcus had finally overreached, had used his influence so aggressively that he'd attracted the attention of people who couldn't be bought or intimidated. "This isn't over," Thornton said, gathering his papers and clearly preparing to retreat. No, it's not, Morrison agreed. But the next phase will be fought on our terms, in Nebraska courts, with proper legal procedures. And Mr. Whitmore will be doing it while explaining to federal investigators why he thought military records were fair game in a domestic dispute. As Thornton's convoy retreated, the assembled community members began to applaud. But their celebration was interrupted by the sound of Maya's voice, clear and determined. "Are we still having a wedding?" she asked, looking around at the crowd. "Because I spent all morning learning Pachelbel's canon on violin, and I really want to play it for the processional." The question broke the tension like sunlight through storm clouds. Pastor Williams stepped forward, straightening his tie and assuming his ceremonial demeanor. "Friends," he announced to the gathered crowd, "we came here for a wedding, and by God, we're going to have one. Maya, get your violin. Graham and Alexandra, take your places. The rest of you form a proper congregation." As the impromptu wedding party arranged itself on the cabin's front lawn, Alexandra felt a profound sense of rightness settle over the moment. This wasn't the elegant ceremony she might have planned in New York, but it was infinitely more meaningful. These people had chosen to stand with them, not out of social obligation, but out of genuine affection and community loyalty. Graham appeared beside her, wearing his best jeans and a button-down shirt that Maya had ironed for him that morning. In his hands were 2 simple gold bands they'd purchased from the jewelry counter at Miller's department store. "Ready?" he asked quietly. "Ready," Alexandra replied, and meant it completely. Maya positioned herself near the porch steps, raised her violin, and began to play. The opening notes of Pachelbel's canon floated across the yard, transforming the simple rural setting into something sacred and eternal. As Alexandra walked toward Graham, not down a church aisle, but across the grass where Theo and Rosie had been learning to identify birds, where Maya had taught them songs, where she'd learned that home wasn't a place, but a feeling, she realized that every step of the past 2 weeks had led to this moment. She wasn't just marrying a man. She was choosing a life that valued love over profit, community over status, presence over productivity. She was choosing to trust that sometimes the most important decisions were made with the heart rather than the head. And as Graham took her hands in his, both of them surrounded by the people who'd become their chosen family, Alexandra knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The sound of Maya's violin mixed with the Nebraska wind, children's laughter carried from the neighboring farm, and in the distance, the church bells of Millbrook began to chime, 2 o'clock, the exact moment when everything in Alexandra's life changed forever. The morning of the wedding dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of golden Nebraska sunlight that made everything look touched by Providence. But by 9 a.m., the peaceful atmosphere was shattered by the sound of helicopter rotors approaching from the east. "Media helicopters," Graham said grimly, watching from the kitchen window as 2 news choppers circled the property like mechanical vultures. "Someone leaked the wedding details." Alexandra looked up from helping Rosie tie the ribbon on her flower girl dresser, simple blue sundress that Maya had decorated with hand-sewn daisies. "How could they know? We only told the people who needed to be here." Maya appeared in the doorway, violin case in hand, her face flushed with anger. "Jenny Morrison's mom works for the Lincoln Journal-Star. She was asking Jenny questions about our family yesterday at school. I bet she called it in." The violation felt personal and bitter. Their small, private ceremony was about to become a media spectacle. Their sacred moment turned into entertainment for strangers who saw only scandal where there should have been celebration. "Dad, what do we do?" Maya asked, and Alexandra could hear the young girl's disappointment beneath her brave facade. Before Graham could answer, his phone rang. The caller ID showed James Morrison. "Alexandra, we have a problem," Morrison said without preamble when Graham put the call on speaker. "Pierce Technologies' board of directors held an emergency meeting this morning. They're invoking the morality clause in your CEO contract." Alexandra felt the blood drain from her face. The morality clause was corporate boilerplate. She'd never expected to be relevant language that allowed the board to remove her from leadership if her personal conduct brought negative attention to the company. On what grounds? She asked, though she suspected she already knew. Public abandonment of fiduciary responsibilities, questionable judgment in personal relationships, and, quote, behavior inconsistent with the professional standards expected of a Fortune 500 CEO. Morrison's voice was carefully controlled, but Alexandra could hear his anger. They're using the media coverage of your relationship with Graham as evidence that you're no longer fit to lead the company. The twins had been playing with blocks in the corner, but now they looked up at the adults with the intuitive awareness children had for tension. What does that mean for the custody case? Graham asked. It means Whitmore's lawyers now have a new argument that Alexandra's reckless personal choices have cost her the business empire she claimed was necessary for providing the children with financial security. Alexandra sank into a kitchen chair, the weight of 18 months of fighting suddenly crushing. She'd built Pierce Technologies from nothing, had revolutionized 3 different industries, had employed thousands of people, and created billions in value. And now it was all being taken away because she'd chosen love over profit. There's more, Morrison continued reluctantly. The board is meeting this afternoon to vote on your replacement. The leading candidate is Marcus Whitmore. The news hit like a physical blow. Marcus hadn't just been content to take her children, he'd been systematically positioning himself to take her company as well. The custody battle had been cover for a corporate takeover that would leave her with nothing. How is that even possible? Alexandra asked. He's not on the board. He doesn't own enough shares. He's been quietly buying shares through shell companies for months, Morrison explained, combined with the board members who've been swayed by his arguments about your instability. He has enough support to force the vote. Maya had been listening with the focused attention she brought to difficult music. Now she spoke up with 12-year-old directness. So he's trying to take away your kids and your company on the same day as your wedding. That appears to be the plan, Morrison confirmed. What a complete jackass, Maya said matter-of-factly. Maya Elizabeth Ellis, Graham said automatically, but his heart clearly wasn't in the reprimand. Well, he is, Maya replied. And if the board thinks Alexandra isn't responsible enough to run a company, they obviously don't know her very well. Before anyone could respond to Maya's assessment, the sound of car doors slamming in the driveway announced new arrivals. Through the window, they could see Pastor Williams, the Hendersons, Mrs. Patterson, and several other community members gathering on the front lawn, despite the circling helicopters. Mrs. Pierce, Mrs. Patterson called through the screen door. We wanted you to know that Channel 7 News tried to interview folks in town about your wedding. They didn't get the responses they were hoping for. Carl Henderson appeared beside her, wearing his best shirt and a satisfied grin. Told them any woman smart enough to pick Graham Ellis for a husband was exactly the kind of person who ought to be running a big company. Same with everyone else they talked to. Pastor Williams stepped forward. Alexandra, I've been officiating weddings for 32 years, and I've learned something important. The people who show up when the world is trying to tear you down are the ones who really matter. Looking out at the small crowd of neighbors and friends who'd driven through media chaos to attend her wedding, Alexandra felt something shift in her chest. These people didn't care about her stock portfolio or her corporate title. They cared about the woman who'd learned to make cocoa with Maya, who'd changed tires with dirt under her fingernails, who'd become part of their community simply by choosing to value what they valued. James, she said into the phone, her voice suddenly steady with decision. Let them have the company. Alexandra, you can't be serious. Pierce Technologies is your life's work. No, she said, looking around the kitchen where she'd learned what family actually meant. Pierce Technologies was my father's dream that I spent 20 years trying to make my own. This is my life's work. She gestured toward Maya, who was tuning her violin with careful precision, and toward the twins, who were now building an elaborate castle with their blocks, completely absorbed in their creative project. But the financial implications for the custody case, Morrison began. Will have to be addressed differently, Alexandra interrupted. Graham, what would it cost to buy a small house here in Millbrook? Something with enough room for all of us? Graham considered the question seriously. Depending on what you wanted, maybe 80,000 for something nice, 120 for something really special. And living expenses for a family of 5? If we're careful and I keep working, maybe 40,000 a year. Alexandra did quick mental math. Her personal savings account, separate from Pierce Technologies and protected from corporate machinations, contained just over $3 million. Even without the company, even without the billionaire lifestyle, she had enough to provide security for her children and the man she was about to marry. James, I want you to call the board and tell them they can have the company with my blessing. But I also want you to make them an offer they can't refuse. What kind of offer? Tell them I'll resign quietly, with no public criticism of their decision, in exchange for my full vesting in the employee stock option program I created 5 years ago. Those stocks belong to the people who actually built the company, not to boardroom opportunists. Morrison was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. That would transfer ownership of nearly 30% of the company to your employees. It would make it much harder for Whitmore to implement any dramatic changes. Exactly. If they want to remove the founder, they can explain to 10,000 employees why their new leadership is more qualified than the person who created their jobs in the first place. As Alexandra outlined her strategy for corporate departure, Maya had been quietly preparing for her role as wedding musician. Now she interrupted with a kind of practical question that reminded everyone why 12-year-olds often saw situations more clearly than adults. "Can we please have the wedding now?" Maya asked. "I practiced Pachelbel's cannon for 2 hours yesterday. There are news helicopters waking up all the farm animals, and Rosie really wants to throw flower petals." Looking at the young girl who'd become her stepdaughter in everything but law, at the twins who'd never been happier or more secure, at the community members who'd risked media attention to celebrate with them, Alexandra realized that Maya was absolutely right. "You know what?" she said, standing up and smoothing her simple cream dress. "Let's have a wedding." Graham moved to stand beside her, and she could see in his expression the same certainty that had been growing in her own heart. They were about to step into a future that looked nothing like either of them had planned, but everything like what they'd been searching for without knowing it. Outside, the helicopters continued their mechanical buzzing. Reporters with telephoto lenses positioned themselves at the property line. And somewhere in New York, corporate boardrooms were deciding the fate of her life's work. But inside the small cabin where she'd learned to make cocoa and change tires and trust in love that wasn't contingent on wealth or success, Alexandra felt more prepared for marriage than she'd ever felt for anything in her life. The first notes of Maya's violin rose above the sound of helicopter rotors as Alexandra stepped onto the front porch of the cabin. She paused for a moment, taking in the scene that would have been impossible to imagine just 2 weeks ago. A small crowd of Nebraska neighbors arranged on the lawn like an impromptu congregation, news helicopters circling overhead like mechanical buzzards, and at the center of it all, the man who'd taught her that home wasn't a place but a feeling. Graham stood beneath the old oak tree where they'd hung a swing for the twins, wearing his best jeans and a white button-down shirt that Maya had pressed with careful attention to detail. In his hands were 2 simple gold bands, purchased from Miller's department, not the designer rings she might have chosen in her previous life, but perfect symbols of the authentic love they'd discovered together. "Dearly beloved," Pastor Williams began, his voice carrying clearly across the yard, despite the media chaos above them. "We are gathered here today not just to witness a marriage, but to celebrate the mysterious ways that broken hearts can find healing in unexpected places." Alexandra walked across the grass toward Graham, not down a church aisle, but across the lawn where Theo and Rosie had learned to identify birds, where Maya had taught them songs, where she'd discovered that the most important things in life couldn't be purchased or negotiated, but only received with an open heart. As she approached, Graham's eyes never left her face. She could see in his expression the same wonder she felt that two people who'd been running from their pasts had somehow found a future together. "Who gives this woman in marriage?" Pastor Williams asked, following the traditional liturgy, even in these thoroughly non-traditional circumstances. "We do," called out Maya, speaking for the twins who flanked her like small honor guards. "We give ourselves to each other." The slight modification of the traditional words made Alexandra's throat tighten with emotion. This wasn't just a marriage between two adults, it was the official formation of a family that had already been growing in daily increments of trust and love. Graham took her hands in his calloused fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over the past 2 weeks. "Alexandra," Pastor Williams said, "do you take this man to be your husband, to love and cherish, in plenty and in want, in joy and in sorrow, in sickness and in health, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Alexandra said, her voice carrying clearly across the yard and up to the helicopters that were recording this moment, for people who would never understand what they were really witnessing. "Graham, do you take this woman to be your wife, to love and cherish, in plenty and in want, in joy and in sorrow, in sickness and in health, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Graham replied, his voice steady and certain. "The rings?" Pastor Williams asked. Maya stepped forward with the simple gold bands, but before handing them over, she paused to address the assembled crowd. "Before they exchange rings, I want to say something," she announced with the fearless honesty that had characterized every important moment of her young life. 2 weeks ago, my dad and I were just getting by. We had each other, and that was enough, but we weren't really living. We were just surviving." She looked directly at Alexandra, her dark eyes serious and wise. "Alexandra, you didn't just bring Theo and Rosie into our family. You brought joy back. You made my dad remember how to laugh. You learned to make cocoa and change tires and help with homework. And you did it all because you wanted to, not because you had to." The words were simple, but they cut through all the media noise and corporate complexity to the essential truth of what had happened in this small Nebraska town. "And Dad," Maya continued, turning to Graham, "you showed Alexandra and the twins what it means to be safe. Not just protected, but really, truly safe where you can be exactly who you are and know that you're loved anyway." Pastor Williams waited respectfully for Maya to finish before continuing the ceremony, but her words had already transformed the moment into something beyond tradition or legal requirement. This was a recognition of love that had grown organically from kindness, trust that had developed through daily acts of care, and commitment that was being made not because it was expected, but because it was chosen. Graham slipped the ring onto Alexandra's finger, his voice quiet but audible to everyone present. "With this ring, I thee wed, and with all that I am and all that I have, I honor you." Alexandra placed the matching band on Graham's finger, feeling the rightness of the gesture in her bones. "With this ring, I thee wed, and with all that I am and all that I have, I honor you. By the power vested in me by the state of Nebraska and the grace of God," Pastor Williams announced, his voice rising above the helicopter noise, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Graham, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was gentle, reverent, and completely unself-conscious, despite the cameras recording from above. When they separated, Alexandra realized that the helicopters had stopped circling. Even the media seemed to recognize that they'd witnessed something too authentic to sensationalize. The crowd erupted in applause and cheers that echoed across the Nebraska countryside. Mrs. Henderson was crying openly. Carl was whooping like a teenager, and Maya was beaming with the satisfaction of someone who'd helped orchestrate something beautiful. But the celebration was interrupted by the sound of a car approaching at high speed, gravel spraying as it skidded to a stop in the driveway. Alexandra's heart sank as she recognized the black sedan of Marcus's people, arriving to disrupt even this moment. Instead, James Morrison emerged from the driver's seat, his usually composed demeanor replaced by excitement and something that looked suspiciously like vindication. "Alexandra," he called out, jogging across the lawn with complete disregard for the formal ceremony that had just concluded. "I have news that couldn't wait." "James, we're kind of in the middle of," Alexandra began, but he cut her off. "The Pierce Technologies board meeting just ended," Morrison announced to the entire wedding party. "They voted to reject Whitmore's takeover bid and formally request that you reconsider your resignation." Alexandra felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "What? How is that possible?" Morrison's grin was triumphant. "Turns out 10,000 employees calling their board members in a single morning carries significant weight. Your stock option transfer proposal was leaked to the press, and the story went viral. Stand with Alexandra has been trending for 3 hours." He pulled out his phone, showing her a screen full of social media posts from Pierce Technologies, employees, customers, and competitors, all expressing support for her leadership and condemning the board's attempt to remove her. "The board realized that firing you would be a public relations disaster that could tank the company's value," Morrison continued. "They're offering full reinstatement, increased autonomy, and a formal apology. Whitmore's been permanently banned from any future involvement with the company." Alexandra looked around at the faces surrounding her Graham's quiet pride, Maya's delighted surprise, the twins' confused but happy expressions, the community members who'd stood by her when her own corporate colleagues had abandoned her. "James," she said finally, "tell the board thank you, but no." Morrison's expression shifted to confusion. "Alexandra, this is everything you've been fighting for." "No," she replied, taking Graham's hand and feeling the solid reality of the choice she was making. "This is everything I used to think I wanted. What I've been fighting for is right here." She gestured toward the simple cabin, the small crowd of neighbors, the family that had formed itself around her when she'd had nothing left to offer but her authentic self. "Pierce Technologies can find a new CEO. There are 100 qualified candidates who would love the opportunity. But there's only one place where I can be, Maya's stepmother, where Theo and Rosie can grow up safe and loved, where I can wake up every morning next to a man who chose me not for what I could provide him, but for who I am when everything else is stripped away." Morrison stared at her as if she'd announced her intention to join a circus. "You're walking away from a billion-dollar company to become a small-town housewife?" "I'm walking toward a life that actually belongs to me," Alexandra corrected gently, "for the first time in 40 years. As if to punctuate her decision, Rosie broke away from Maya's supervision and ran toward Alexandra, flower petals from her basket scattering in her wake. "Mommy Alexandra," she called out, using the title that had evolved naturally over the past 2 weeks. "Can we have cake now, and can we live here forever and ever?" Alexandra scooped up her daughter, because that's what Rosie had become, legally and emotionally, and looked into the trusting face that had helped teach her what really mattered. "Yes, sweetheart," she said, her voice carrying across the yard to everyone present. "We can live here forever and ever." The media helicopters had finally given up and departed, leaving only the sound of wind through the oak trees and the contented voices of people who'd chosen to celebrate love over spectacle. As the wedding party moved toward the cabin for cake and coffee, Alexandra realized that she was exactly where she belonged, not because she'd achieved something or acquired something, but because she'd learned to recognize home when she found it. 6 months later, on a warm August evening that smelled of cut grass and the promise of a good harvest, Alexandra sat on the front porch of their new house, watching Graham teach Theo how to properly hold a hammer. The house wasn't much bigger than the cabin, just 4 bedrooms and a wraparound porch that caught both the morning and evening light, but it was theirs in a way that her Manhattan penthouse had never been. Maya emerged from the house carrying her violin case, her hair pulled back in the neat bun she preferred for practice. At 13, she'd grown 3 inches and gained the kind of confidence that came from knowing exactly where she belonged in the world. "Dad, Mrs. Patterson wants to know if you can help build risers for the fall concert," Maya said, settling into the porch swing they'd hung the weekend after moving in. "She says the high school kids are too tall for the current setup." "Tell her I'll be there Saturday morning," Graham replied, not looking up from where he was guiding, Theo's small hands in driving a nail into the birdhouse they were constructing together. Might be good to get some of the other dads involved too. Alexandra smiled at how naturally Graham had slipped into the role of community volunteer coordinator. His handyman business had grown beyond anything he'd imagined, partly because of his skills, but mostly because people trusted him completely. When Graham Ellis said he'd fix something, it stayed fixed. "How was the regional orchestra audition?" Alexandra asked Maya, who'd driven to Lincoln that afternoon with Mrs. Patterson for her final evaluation. Maya's face lit up with the kind of joy that made everyone around her happy, just by proximity. "I got in, not just regular admission first chair violin for my age group." The announcement brought Theo and Rosie running from the yard, where they'd been engaged in some complicated game involving a rope swing and elaborate rules only they understood. At 6 years old, the twins had adapted to small-town life with the resilience that seemed to characterize children who'd finally found stability. "Maya got first chair," Rosie announced to the neighborhood, her voice carrying clear to the Henderson farm next door. "She's the best violin player in all of Nebraska." "Not all of Nebraska," Maya corrected with a laugh, but Alexandra could see the pride in her stepdaughter's expression. "Just the regional youth orchestra." "Same thing," Theo said with 6-year-old authority. "You're the best at everything musical." As the family celebrated Maya's achievement with impromptu porch dancing and off-key singing, Alexandra reflected on how different their evening routine had become. 6 months ago, her evenings had been consumed by international conference calls, market analysis, and strategic planning sessions that stretched past midnight. Now her most pressing evening obligation was helping Rosie practice reading and making sure Theo brushed his teeth thoroughly. The financial adjustment had been easier than she'd expected. Alexandra had established a small consulting firm that worked with tech startups, allowing her to use her business expertise while maintaining complete control over her schedule. Between her consulting income and Graham's growing construction business, they lived comfortably without extravaganza, lifestyle that felt infinitely more sustainable than her previous corporate existence. "Alexandra," Graham said, joining her on the porch steps as the children settled into their pre-bedtime routine. "James Morrison called this afternoon. He wanted to give you an update on the Pierce Technologies situation." Alexandra had maintained minimal contact with her former company, partly out of curiosity but mostly to ensure that the employee stock transfer she'd negotiated was being honored. "What's the news?" "Stock price is up 30% since the new CEO took over. Employee satisfaction surveys are the highest in company history. And Marcus Whitmore's companies are under federal investigation for corporate espionage." The news about Marcus should have provided some sense of vindication, but Alexandra found that she felt mostly indifferent. The man who'd once dominated her thoughts and threatened her peace had become irrelevant to her actual life. "More importantly," Graham continued, "Morrison wanted to let you know that the custody case has been officially dismissed. With Whitmore's legal troubles and the federal investigation, his lawyers withdrew all claims regarding the twins." Alexandra felt a weight she hadn't realized she was still carrying lift from her shoulders. The legal threat that had driven her to Nebraska in the first place was finally, completely resolved. "So it's over," she said. "All of it. All of it." Graham confirmed, taking her hand in his. "Theo and Rosie are legally and permanently ours. The corporate drama is behind us. We're just a regular family in a small town, worrying about regular things like school concerts and birdhouse construction." Through the open front door, they could hear Maya practicing scales while the twins got ready for bed, their voices mixing with the evening sounds of rural Nebraska. It was the sound of home not grand or impressive, but authentic and lasting. "Graham," Alexandra said, watching fireflies begin to blink in the gathering dusk. "Do you ever miss it? The excitement, the high stakes, the feeling that what you were doing mattered on a large scale?" Graham considered the question seriously, the way he approached all her moments of doubt and reflection. "I miss the clarity sometimes," he said finally. "In the military, you always knew exactly what the mission was and whether you'd succeeded, but I don't miss the cost of that clarity." He gestured toward the house where their children were settling into the rhythm of another peaceful evening. "This matters on the only scale that really counts. When Theo learns to build something with his hands, when Rosie reads her first chapter book, when Maya plays violin with joy instead of anxiety, that's success measured in the currency that actually matters." As if summoned by their conversation, Maya appeared in the doorway with her violin, ready for her evening practice session on the porch. It had become a family tradition, Maya's music, mixing with the sounds of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle from neighboring farms. "What should I play tonight?" Maya asked, settling into her usual spot on the porch rail. "Something that sounds like contentment," Alexandra suggested, not entirely sure what that would translate to musically. Maya thought for a moment, then raised her violin and began to play. The melody was something Alexandra didn't recognize, probably one of Maya's own compositions, which had become increasingly sophisticated over the past months. The music was neither sad nor exuberant, but something more complex, satisfaction, perhaps, or the sound of people who'd found exactly where they belonged. As the last notes faded into the Nebraska evening, Rosie's voice called from inside the house. "Mommy Alexandra, Daddy Graham, we're ready for story time." Alexandra stood up, brushing dust from her jeans, another small pleasure she'd discovered, wearing clothes that were chosen for comfort rather than corporate image. "Coming, sweetheart." Walking into the house they'd made together, surrounded by the family that had formed itself around love rather than obligation or convenience, Alexandra realized that she'd achieved something she'd never known she was searching for. Not success as the world measured it, but success as the heart understood it. A life built on connection, presence, and the daily choice to value what truly mattered. The last light of the August evening painted everything golden as the Ellis family settled into their nightly ritual of stories and songs, the simple domestic pleasures that had become the foundation of their shared life. Outside, the Nebraska landscape stretched endlessly under a sky full of stars, promising another day of small miracles and ordinary grace. And in the warm circle of lamplight, where four people who'd found each other against all odds were creating the memories that would last a lifetime, Alexandra finally understood what it meant to be truly, completely home.